Hi, friend. I know these stories on the podcast are so encouraging to hear as you listen to others who have walked through unimaginable pain and found hope in it, and they've walked through it. But I also know that how to move forward can be the question that so many of you guys who are listening to this or watching this on YouTube, you're asking that question currently as you're walking through the valley. I know when I think about my own journey after losing my wife, Amanda, I wish that I had had something practical, a guide to walk me through the pain and the process of healing, which is why we created the Pain to Purpose course. The Pain to Purpose course is truly a guide to help you remove the debris of crisis in your life and move forward with a renewed sense of victory and purpose. Hundreds have taken the course and found so much hope and healing in their own story. But I want you to listen to what Jera had to say about how the course helped her find her way out of anxiety and depression.
I came in a very low spot in my life. I was walking through depression. I was walking through a lot of anxiety. That led me to some really poor decisions in my life that got me to the place where I thought I was no longer worthy to be used by God. In the course, I learned a lot of practical tips when I'm feeling unworthy or when I'm really low. First, I learned how to label all those feelings, and then I learned to say, no, this biblical truth is that God loves me, that I am purposeful, that He put me here for a reason, and I had to put that before my unworthiness that I was feeling.
So if you're ready to take the next step in healing from whatever hurt you've walked through and want help in how to identify your pain and how to move forward, sign up now for the Pain to Purpose course by going to course.nothingiswasted.com. Again, that's course.nothingiswasted.com. You'll have access to all the course videos and everything you need to start moving from pain into purpose. So often we continue to walk around with unprocessed pain and trauma without the guidance that we actually need in order to navigate our inner world. Let Nothing is Wasted Ministries help you on the path towards healing and wholeness. Go to course.nothingiswasted.com.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Nothing is Wasted podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Aubrey Sampson, and joined by...
I'm Davey Blackburn. It's so good to have you guys back this week. I love the fact that every single week, every Thursday morning, you know that in your inbox, in your podcast platform, YouTube, whatever it is, that we get to hang out with you.
I know, isn't that fun? You know what's so funny is today one of our really good friends, mutual friends, Davey Taylor Carlier, who used to work here at Nothing is Wasted.
Yeah.
We love her dearly. She and I were on the phone on a Thursday morning, and we both got pop-ups about the new episode. We were like, oh, Nothing is Wasted is here. So you're right.
Yes.
I love that we get to pop into people's hearts and souls on Thursday mornings.
It's awesome. Aubrey, we have some incredible conversations every single week. We have conversations with people that we would say we call them our unsung heroes, because maybe they're people that, they don't necessarily have a large platform. You don't really know them. They haven't written anything about this. They're like, but we hear their story. We come across it in our journey and we're like, oh my gosh, you need to be on our podcast. You got to share your story because it's so, amazing how God's showing up in your pain. And then there's some people that we're like, oh my gosh, if we could ever have a conversation with this person, we don't know them personally. We don't, but we've been watching from afar. We've been mentored by them from afar. And that's what we have today.
We have that today. And I was telling you, Davey, before we started recording today, that this person is kind of a household name for like Wheaton College people. I'm a Wheaton College grad and undergrad. And for probably a lot of people in Christendom, mostly because of one of his earlier books, a book called What's So Amazing About Grace. Mm-hmm. So I may have just given away just buried the lead there. But Philip Yancey is our guest today.
Philip Yancey.
It's kind of a thing at Wheaton College where someone will make a great, preacher will quote something and then they'll go, I don't know, it's either C.S. Lewis or Philip Yancey. Like he is just, he is integrated into evangelical Christianity, but in a meaningful way.
Modern day C.S. Lewis, right? Totally. That's kind of what we know him. We all know him as, especially if you have. I grew up reading his writings, reading the things that he, the books he had, and so he is that contemporary version for us, and he's thoughtful.
So thoughtful.
He's deliberate. Yes. He digs deep into things, and yet he makes it very accessible to all of us, and we can all relate. And one of the things he'll say in this conversation is that he found the thread of his writings were two things: either pain and suffering or God's grace. And so all of his writings kind of have that peppered in there. Most recently, he's released a memoir called Where the Light Fell. And so we talk a bit about his own journey of pain and suffering, his own observations of pain and suffering. It is definitely a Nothing is Wasted type of conversation Philip Yancey style. So
Ugh.
you're going to love this.
It's going
It's
to
going
be
to be,
so powerful. I cannot
it's
wait
going to be
for
so
that.
rich.
Hey, before
Get
we
your notebooks
listen,
out.
yeah,
Oh, go
seriously,
ahead.
take
Yes.
notes, quote this guy for sure. Before we take a
Yes.
listen to your conversation with Philip Yancey, there's a couple of updates. I want to let you talk about the book, Davey, but before I
Oh,
do
yeah.
that, I just want to remind our listeners, if you are looking to take your next step here with Nothing is Wasted, we would love to invite you to join us for a free live call. It's with Davey himself. It's 5 steps for taking back your story. And just go to nothingiswasted.com/start here. Nothingiswasted.com/start here to find out more about that. But Davey,
Yeah.
give us just super quick.
Yeah,
book
real
release
quick.
Updates.
You guys already know this. We're releasing Nothing Is Wasted, the book, July 30th. We're so
Woohoo!
excited about this. But what we have coming up soon is that pre-orders will begin April 1st. So you
That's
can
so
actually
soon.
pre-order the book April 1st. And what's really great about this is we've got a lot of like pre-order. If you pre-order the book, we've got a lot of, extras that we're throwing in there, bonuses we're throwing in there. And you're going to want to make sure you pay attention to our launch event that we're doing.
Yeah.
So you can find all this information out, nothingiswastedbook.com. And we'd love for you to join our launch team. If you want to help us get the word out about the book, if Nothing Is Wasted, the ministry has impacted you, one of the things that we do for our launch team members is we give you a copy of the manuscript early so you can read the entire book
Awesome.
before anybody else. And that way you can help us get the word out there about that. So go to
I love book launch
nothingiswastedbook.com
teams.
to find all that information out. And speaking of writing books, the GOAT, come on, greatest of all time,
Philip
arguably,
Yancey?
Philip Yancey.
For real.
Here's my conversation with Philip Yancey. Well, Philip Yancey, it's so great to have you on the Nothing Is Wasted podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this, the Davey.
Well, man, I've been looking forward to it so much too. I know growing up, I read so many of your books, and they were early on very formative in my own faith journey. And, so much so you wouldn't even know this, that when a massive crisis and tragedy hit my life and losing my wife and our unborn baby, there was so much that I was drawing from, even the works that I read of you. And so thank you so much. Thank you for everything you've done for the kingdom and for spending time with us here today.
It's an adjustment for me because I started out as an editor of a youth magazine called Campus Life Magazine. And now people who come up to me say, my grandparents love your books, and that's been kind of an adjustment. But Nothing Is Wasted applies to getting older as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, but the more that we're around this and interacting with, there's obviously some incredible, new authors, upcoming authors and stuff. The more I'm around it, though, the more I just love this stuff that I guess you could deem as old, right? I mean, I think I'm reading a lot more of the dead guys and than I am the contemporary ones. And you're one of those that I feel like it's such a foundational, deep, rich heritage of your work. So thank you. I mean, it's just an incredible thing to have you on this conversation. I'd love for you to share. There may be some people who don't know who you are. I'd love for you to just give us a little summary of who you are and what you do. And then we'll dive into, I really want to circle a lot of this around the memoir you released last year, Where the Light Fell, and some of your story. And so tell us a little bit about who you are, and then we'll dive into that.
Yes, as I mentioned, began my career writing for Campus Life Magazine. And the more I wrote, the more I felt articles aren't long enough. I'm grabbing into some pretty heavy material, so I need a longer form. And I started writing books. My very first book was a book called Where is God When It Hurts? So there you are. It's a question we all have at some point. Yeah. And later people wrote me and said, well, my problem isn't actually physical pain. It's more emotional pain. It's more a sense of betrayal because God doesn't act the way I want God to act, and my prayers don't get answered. And so I'm kind of disappointed, even betrayed by God. Yeah. And I wrote a book called Disappointment with God. And over the years, I guess I've concentrated on 2 themes, Davey. First theme is suffering, and it keeps coming up. And just not that long ago, I wrote another book on suffering called The Question That Never Goes Away, because it doesn't ever go away. And the other theme that comes through is grace. Those are the 2 things. I wrote a book called What's So Amazing About Grace after studying the Bible and realizing that the Christian environment I grew up in, we talked about this word grace, but I didn't really experience it as a kid growing up. And as I got into the Bible, as I got into Jesus' life, I realized that grace is what it's all about. And somehow it's easy for a church to slide into, let's be good, let's kind of moralism, and really miss the message of grace that invites the people who would never think of going to a church. Jesus attracted those kind of people. Yeah. And generally, a lot of people, when you ask them, they think of church as places where do-gooders go. Yeah. Well, actually, the only people who go to church are the people who recognize that we're not do-gooders, that we need God's grace, we need forgiveness. Otherwise, there are a lot more interesting ways to spend your Sunday than going to church. But we need that. We need the energy and the power that comes from being accepted and loved by a God who can take whatever happens, no matter what we've done. And the Bible is full of those stories. Think about it. The best people, the giants, are murderers like Moses and adulterers like David and persecutors of Christians like the Apostle Paul and deniers of Jesus like the Apostle Peter. These are the greatest. These are the giants of the Bible. And they're people who did things we would never dream of doing or want to do. And yet God found a way to not only forgive them, but to turn them into the giants of the faith.
It's amazing. And what's so interesting is that, when I was a local church pastor, in a church planter, we were building this culture and this idea of like, we want people who would never think about stepping foot through the doors of a church, coming to church. We want them to experience the transformative power of Jesus and the grace that he offers, the forgiveness that he offers. But when you start to actually experience that, people coming in, it gets really messy, right? And so I think that's why a lot of times pastors and church leaders, that seems like an ideal thing, but the practicality of it going, wait a minute, it feels a little bit easier and more contained to kind of control with moralism or people's behavior because I feel better about what's going on.
Yeah, grace is only put to the test when you're around people who aren't like you, that you don't feel comfortable around. And if you're just around people who vote like you, think like you, dress like you, which we tend to do, then the grace is never tested. Grace is put to the test when you're around people who are offensive, morally offensive to you, people who see the world in very different ways. And that's what I have learned so much from watching Jesus, because imagine the Son of God who knew exactly what God had in mind with the human race and his ideals of what a human should be, how a human should live. How offensive it must have been to Jesus to just be around ordinary people, much less the sinners, the real sinners. And yet it was the real sinners, the people who were the rejects of society that other people look down upon. Those are the ones who sense Jesus has something that I need. I lack that. My church in Chicago, we allowed an AA group, recovery group, Alcoholics Anonymous, to meet in the downstairs of our church. A lot of churches don't do that because they may not be drinking anymore, but they drink a lot of coffee and they smoke cigarettes, whether they're supposed to or not. And so, a lot of churches don't like that. But this is the downstairs. We had a linoleum floor, no nice carpets. They were welcome to use it. And then there was the upstairs church. And I several times went with a friend of mine to the downstairs church and was just so struck with how honest and raw and open they were. You could never get away with pretending to be more than you are. They can spot a lie. They can spot somebody scamming them a mile away. And they would start by identifying their sin. Hi, I'm Bob, I'm an alcoholic, or no, I'm George, I'm a drug addict. And the worst thing about them is what they started with. And then we'd go upstairs and I would say, well, have you guys ever thought about going to the upstairs church? Oh, I'd never go there. Well, why not? well, I mean, those people have it all together, and they dress so nice, and they have jobs and they're responsible. And I said, well, yeah, actually, I know some of those people, and you may have it wrong, but you have something that they need, that we need upstairs church. We need that honesty, because the hardest thing for any human being is to admit, I can't make it on my own. I've messed up. I need help. I need God's help. And that is what the church should be about. But instead, as you say, it becomes kind of a competition. I'm more spiritual than you are, and I have more truth than that denomination over there.
Right.
That's what we tend to do. And look at how Jesus treated the Pharisees. In some ways, they were the most like him in terms of morality and love for the Bible and all that. And yet, he was aware that they could miss the whole message by concentrating on these little petty things and judging other people instead of looking at their own failures and relying on God's grace.
Yeah. Wow, that's so good. Well, Philip, in the memoir you released last year, where the light fell, you talk quite a bit about this dissonance that you experienced growing up. We could say dissonance, we could say disappointment, we could say tragedies in your family of origin. As you experience a lot of this legalistic type culture, and yet it didn't seem to line up with the Jesus that you were learning about.
Yeah.
Why don't you dive into that a little bit? Because it led you to a little bit of a crisis, too, in your own faith. And it's a crisis that I think is akin to what so many people right now are experiencing in this whole deconstruction movement.
Sure. Yes. Probably the seminal event in my life happened when I was just a year old, so I wasn't even aware of it. My parents were planning to be missionaries in Africa. They were trained, they were ready, they had raised support, they had people praying for them, they were getting ready to go. And then one day my father woke up and he was totally paralyzed. This was 1950, and there was a pandemic going on. It was a pandemic of polio. And mostly polio hit young children, 5 to 7 years old. My father was 23, I think. And it was overnight. And he was taken to this one charity hospital, and there was only one place in Atlanta at the time that had an iron lung. He was so paralyzed that he couldn't even breathe on his own. So this iron lung was a machine that just forced air in and out and forced his lungs to contract and expand. And that kept him alive. If they had taken him out of the iron lung, he would die within hours. He was that dependent on it.
Wow.
But what an existence, just lying there staring at the ceiling all day. They had no TVs. It was a charity hospital. And he was miserable. And other people around him decided that can't be God's will for this young man with such promise, going to be a missionary, to have an existence like this. So we believe in a God of healing. We believe he will be healed. And so they got together and had prayer meetings and truly did believe. And against all medical advice, he was taken out of that iron lung. And for a couple of days, he felt like he was feeling maybe a little sensation in his toe that he hadn't felt before. Maybe there was a healing on the way. But about a little over a week later, he died. And I never knew that story, that backstory of the failed healing, until I was about 18 years old. I was in college, and I came across an account of it in the Atlanta Journal and Constitution magazine. So here was this tremendous event that in many ways determined our lives, that I didn't even know about, and it was hidden from me. And I learned early on that not everyone who claims to speak for God does so.
Wow.
And in something like when you're dealing with suffering people, and I know there are people who make a really good living on TV and in the radio, promising if you just send for this handkerchief or whatever, then God will heal you, no matter what it is. We need to be very careful in speaking for God.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned some of the grace issues. This was Atlanta in the 1950s and 1960s. The civil rights movement was just taking off. Martin Luther King Jr. was our most famous citizen. And my church was on the wrong side of that issue. It was against integration. saw and taught that people of color were inferior. They were cursed by God, this crazy curse of Ham theory. And it was a crisis for faith for me to realize my church was wrong. They were teaching false doctrine. They were teaching lies. And if they lied about race, maybe they lied about the Bible. Maybe they lied about Jesus. Maybe they were just wrong. And I went through a period of just rejecting and suspending my faith for a period of time. Even though I was still in church and actually went to a Christian college, I was stepping aside. We use the word deconstructing. we didn't do that back then, but we do now. And that's what I was doing. I was trying to figure out what is worth keeping here. What can I hold on to, and what do I need to let go of? Because my church was wrong about race, and these people have been wrong about God's will in healing my father. So what can I count on? And frankly, Davey, that's what I've been doing ever since. That's what I do as a writer. I'm a freelancer, and I'm not representing any organization or any church necessarily. I'm just piece by piece looking best I can at the Bible on these various issues. What is the secret of suffering here? What can we count on? What can we not count on? And the whole issue of grace. How can a church get this foundational thing wrong? And years before slavery, there were good Christian people in the South who were strongly in favor of slavery. How can we get some of those things wrong and then worry about, in the 60s, we were worried about the length of hair, or now it would be tattoos, or, is dancing permissible, or drinking. We were concentrating on all these things, and yet we missed a pretty foundational thing about treating people as made in the image of God, which we were not doing with people of color.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think that, what I love about what you were doing, and you said, I was deconstructing, even though we didn't have that terminology necessarily now, because now that terminology has become a buzzword, and it has, in some circles, become very pejorative. In other circles, it's been used as like a label as an excuse to walk away from the faith. I mean, there's so many different things that are happening right now with that idea of deconstruction. But what I'm observing, and what a lot of people, as we're having these conversations, is observing, is that for a long time, the church hasn't been a safe space where we can bring our doubts and our questions about God. Our experiences and our suffering there's this cognitive dissonance between that and how we've constructed God to be, right? He's not doing what we want us to do. He's not the vending machine God that we thought he should be in our lives. And so now it's causing a disorientation, but the church hasn't been a safe space to bring those questions. That's what I love about your work, is you've been a safe space for people to ask those questions because you were asking those questions. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious, if you were talking to people based on your own experience who were in that process of deconstructing, how would you guide them through that process? Because there's a whole swath of people who are deconstructing but just walking away from the faith.
Right.
So how do we find that tension between, let's deconstruct the human construct of religion, faith, really, and really reconstruct then on a strong biblical foundation a relationship with Jesus?
I've often had a conversation right along that line, Davey. I'll be maybe sitting in an airplane or in a doctor's lobby, waiting to be called, and I'll talk with a stranger. What do you do? Well, I'm a writer. Really? What kind of books do you write? And if I really want to be left alone, I've got some work to do, I'll say the truth. I'll say, well, I'm a Christian writer who writes about existential questions of faith. And they say, oh, okay. And then they turn away, and I can get some work done. But sometimes they'll say, oh, that's really interesting. What would some of your books be? And I tell them, and they'll kind of sit back with a wistful look and say, yeah, I kind of used to be into that religion stuff, but I went to a Young Life program when I was growing up. Went to a camp. Those are nice days. I got good memories. I said, really? What happened? And then they'll tell me my story, their own story of the way their parents were treated when they got divorced, or when their brother turned out to be gay, or some story where the church didn't handle that very well.
Yeah.
And I'll say, oh, well, the church is a lot worse than that. Let me tell you my story. And they'll say, well, wait a minute. I thought you were a Christian writer. I said, well, I am. But it wouldn't be a good trade, would it, to trade away the opportunity to have a direct relationship with the God who created this universe because of the way your parents were treated 30 years ago.
Wow.
And I came to terms, and I said, I went through all the criticisms that we've been talking about here, and I know the flaws of the church. I can kind of out-church you on that. But I would just encourage you to find another place to land. And let's take this thing of suffering. Often they'll tell me a story about suffering, and your organization says it very well. Nothing is wasted. We do not have the promise from the New Testament, especially, that our lives are going to be easy. In fact, quite the contrary. Jesus told his disciples, it's going to be tough. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to be vilified, and some of you are going to die. And yet Paul, who was one of those people who had all the morality but missed the grace part, and when he finally understood what was going on, he was a transformed person. He did not have an easy life. And in Romans 8, he goes back and reviews his biography, and it included shipwreck and snake bite and prison and running from the authorities and escapes in a basket over a wall, the whole story of his life. But he looked back and he said, in all of these things, God was working for my good. And in Romans 8, he finishes that chapter with that amazing benediction that there's nothing that can separate us from God's love. Nothing.
Yeah.
And he lists everything you can imagine: the height, the breadth, the history, future. Nothing can separate me from God's love. And that's the promise that we have. I like to think of God as the great recycler. I still have one of these cathode ray TVs, these giant things, 25 inches or whatever. They weigh a couple hundred pounds. And somebody had a electronic recycling place, and I was kind of offended because here I am giving them this TV, and I had to pay $25 for them to recycle it. Wait a minute, I'm giving you this TV, and I had to get a friend to help me throw it up into the big Dempsey dumpster, and there goes my TV. And they send it to places like, I don't know, Vietnam, Myanmar, where people scrape little rare earths and bits of gold and things and recycle them. And probably that giant TV became part of a little phone like this, a smartphone that's smarter than any computer I had used up to that point, And I think, wow, I think that's what Paul's getting at in Romans 8. And as other people in the Bible, James, Peter, the same message. Not you won't have any problems. Oh no, you will have problems. But God can take even the things that we want to get rid of, even the garbage of our lives, and can make out of it something meaningful. So I understand people who walk away from the church. Right. I do encourage them, though, don't just walk away, walk towards something.
That's good.
And I think what we get in a mature, balanced faith is something that deals with life as it is. Life is unfair. Life, you went through this great tragedy. I went through a very different kind of tragedy. And then some people seem to just kind of coast through with everything going well at a certain point, but maybe their own children will have a disease or something, or a birth defect they have to struggle with. So Christianity is very realistic about life. It's beautiful. It's great. It's the planet is a spectacular planet. The human body is an amazing, fearfully and wonderfully made creation by God. But things go wrong. People go wrong. there is evil in the world, and God is not satisfied with this world. That's a message. Sometimes I've had to go to places like Sandy Hook,
Right.
after the shootings there in Newtown, Connecticut, and other mass places of mass pain. And what I say to them is you grieve, God grieves more. You're unhappy with the state of this planet. God is more unhappy. And I can say that because God became one of us. God,
right.
in Jesus. If you want to know how God feels about this world, just follow Jesus around. Jesus didn't say, well, it's tough world, get used to it. Wherever there was pain, he did something about it. Now, he didn't heal everybody in the world. He was only dealing with a small group of people in one little corner of the Roman Empire. But he gave a clue, and then he told us to pray that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's a tough prayer. That's a hard prayer, and we're not going to be able to do that on our own. It's going to take more interventions by God. But we are to be the representatives of comfort and healing.
Right.
In 2 Corinthians 1, Paul is so clear. He talks about the God of all comfort and the Father of compassion. And he says, the comfort that you have received, your job is to take that comfort and spread it abroad. Because Jesus didn't stick around very long. He left.
Yeah.
But he left us. He left the church behind. And we are to be followers of Jesus who let the world know what God is really like, how God feels about what's going on down here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what one of the things that you said off air before we started having this conversation, that the ministry that we do, you alluded to, like, wow, that must be a really fun ministry. Yeah. And it was kind of in jest, right? And, acknowledge it's very heavy. And yet at the same time, one of the things I love about the ministry that we do is it is such a beautiful invitation into evangelism, because we have the opportunity to interact with a hurting world and help them to see that Jesus is with them in their hurting and is also inviting them to partner with him in making things right. John 11, Jesus comes upon the scene with Lazarus, and he knows he's going to raise him from the dead, and yet it says Jesus wept.
Yeah.
And I believe that was this just all-encompassing, very poignant scripture, but all-encompassing concept that Jesus is not, like what you just said, Philip, he is not okay with and happy with. He's grieved over the state of this world, over the fallenness of mankind and how sin has fractured everything. And that's largely why we experience pain and suffering. And so I love that, as we're talking about deconstruction, disappointment in the church, it's really important for us to parse out, who are we really disappointed in? Well, we're disappointed in fallen human beings. Where do we run to, as you said? Well, we run to Jesus.
Hey friends, I know that so many of you listening to this are carrying a heavy weight of pain and loss. When we start to process what's happened in our lives, we often find ourselves paralyzed by the pain and not really knowing where to go from here. We even begin to hear or tell ourselves lies like, this is the end of our story. This will define you. And trust me, I've been there. But with the help of others, I was able to navigate my way out of that valley. And at Nothing is Wasted, we exist to help you navigate your pain and even find purpose in that pain. So if you are new to our community and wondering where to start, or if you've been with us for some time and you're just looking to take the next step, we're hosting a free live call just for you. In it, we're going to talk about 5 steps to taking back your story, no matter what you've gone through. In this call, our founder, Davey Blackburn, will share more of his story, and he's going to teach you 5 critical steps you'll have to take to rewrite your own story. This call is 60 minutes long, but I promise you it will be well worth your time, because in it you will learn how to regain a sense of agency and begin thriving, not just surviving in the midst of trying circumstances. Why having more questions than answers may be an essential part of moving forward. How to get rid of the overwhelming negative emotions that tend to bog you down and get you stuck. The one keystone decision that will help you get out of your pain. How to listen to the right voices when everyone seems to have an opinion on what you should do next, and a ton more. If you are feeling weighed down or paralyzed by the pain you've experienced, you don't have to stay there. And Davey will be your guide and show you the way back to thriving. Go to nothingiswasted.com/start here to sign up for this free live call. Or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, just click the link in the show notes. We've made it extremely easy to sign up, and we're offering multiple dates and time options for you for this live call to work with your calendar. I believe this one step could be the very breakthrough you need to put you on the redemptive path God has for you. Open the browser on your phone right now and go to nothingiswasted.com/start here, or just click the link we've included in the show notes of this episode. We are in your corner, and we can't wait to connect with you soon.
Yeah, I remember attending a church service at a large mega church in the Chicago area, and they had a representative who was Buddhist, and one who was Muslim, and one who was Hindu, and then one of their pastors, and they were all up on the platform, and they came up with, I think, 3 different questions. One of them was, what is your concept of God? Another one was, if somebody has really messed up their life, what would your religion suggest that they do about that? And the third one was the question of suffering. And, you know, the Buddhist person said, well, we believe that suffering is mostly it's mental, and if we straighten out the way people think, then there wouldn't be very much suffering in the world. Okay. And the Hindu and the Muslim both said pretty clearly, well, we believe that suffering is God's way of correcting injustice. And so if you do something wrong, God will punish you. If you do something right, God will reward you. Karma. The Hindu used that word. And sometimes it will take many, many incarnations, thousands of incarnations, before justice is balanced in your life. And the Christian had a more complicated answer. He said, well, we believe suffering is real, unlike my Buddhist person here, and we believe that God doesn't like it, and God promises to do something about it someday and change this planet so that it has different rules, so that the lion can lie down by the lamb, those kind of things, the images from the prophets. But we also believe that while we are here, the emblem of our religion is a cross people wear even as jewelry around their necks or earrings, and that's the picture that we have, that God can take the worst thing that can happen, the murder of his son, and turn it into the best thing, the salvation of this planet. And so we believe God is unhappy with this planet. We believe suffering is real. God will do something about it, and God can do something in us, even in those days when we're in that in-between time before God does redo the rules of the planet.
Yeah. Wow. So poignantly put.
I was privileged to interview Bono of U2.
Oh yeah.
At one time, and he said, when it boils down, the world either runs by karma or by grace. And I'm going to cast my lot with grace.
Yeah.
It was a good line.
Yeah. Everybody wants karma until they have to actually adhere to that in their own life, right? Oh, man. I'd love to merge these two concepts. I mean, you spent most of your writing career talking about suffering and talking about grace. I'm curious your thoughts in how those two coalesce. What part does grace play in our suffering? What part does suffering play in grace? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. One thing I've learned living in the mountains, I live near Denver, Colorado, and I could look out my window right now, and there's a creek that's mostly frozen right now. And if I drive just a mile down the road, I can see where that creek comes from. It's a mountain that's 14,000 feet high. And you can actually trace a trail all the way down from that mountain down to about 7,000 feet where I live. And it's the same water. Right now it's snow and ice, but stick around, and in May and June, it's going to be a roaring creek. And I learned that grace, like water, always flows to the lowest part. And back to where we started, the downstairs church you know, the alcoholics, the drug addicts, the people
Yeah.
whose lives are a mess. They're the ones who recognize the water that I've been drinking in Jesus' day, that's not enough. I need something else. And he's got what I need.
Mm.
It's like the woman at the well who had really messed up her life. And Jesus said, I've got a different kind of water. It's living water. It gives you strength. It doesn't just keep you from scorching. It gives you energy and strength. Grace, like water, always flows to the lowest part. And then part of that, as followers of Jesus, our call is to go to those low places. So, and you know, the church does a pretty good job of that. I'm a journalist. I've been around the world. Wherever there has been a trail of missionaries, you find clinics and orphanages and people digging wells and running feeding programs and fighting human trafficking. And that's true here too. Even the mega churches, they're not just entertainment venues. They've got prison ministries going. I know you guys do. And they're running homeless shelters and things like that, missions in downtown areas. And that's grace. So that, for me, that's how grace and suffering come together. We don't look at suffering and say, well, that's just karma, so they deserve that. You know, that's not Christian. And followers of Jesus want to be like Jesus, and he would go to those people, the neediest people, the people who recognized they weren't making it on their own. And
Right.
those are the ones that Jesus would bring healing and comfort and a sense of presence.
Yeah, I love that. I know in my own experience, you know, just anecdotally, in walking through the kind of suffering that I've walked through over the past 8 years since losing my wife, I felt that my grace has grown, my empathy has grown for people, you know, but I don't know if you would say, you know, I'm curious what you would say about that. I'm not sure I see that in everybody that walks through suffering. It seems like that there's maybe a place where the roads diverge for people as they're walking through suffering. It's like they can either choose to grow in grace. Maybe it's like an invitation that God extends to us in the midst of our suffering, or they can choose to grow more calloused. I'm curious of your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, there's a phrase in a great book about pain, The Problem of Pain by C.S.
Yeah.
Lewis. There's this phrase. He says something along the line that God whispers to us in the good times, but shouts to us in the hard times.
That's
That
right.
pain is the megaphone of God. That's a phrase he uses, the megaphone of God. And when I first came across that phrase, I kind of winced, and I still do a little bit, because a lot of people think that when I say that, a lot of people have an image like this that comes to mind, and that's like a football coach on the sidelines. He's yelling at his people, okay, give me 100 more push-ups, go around, I need 4 miles around the track, you know, just, that's the megaphone.
Right.
It's like the army sergeant. And some people do believe that God does that. I'll teach that person. And I just don't see that in the New Testament at all. And certainly that wasn't the message that Jesus had. The disciples, the Pharisees kept saying, why is this person suffering? Is it because of something he did? And Jesus would always refute that. He would never go down that path.
Right.
I would use a different image. And I love C.S. Lewis, and I don't think he had that distortion in mind that I just described. But pain is kind of like a hearing aid. And when it occurs, you can't avoid it. It's right there.
Right.
It's in your face. It just disrupts life. It invades your life. And you've got one of two responses. You can either turn down the hearing aid. And a lot of people do that. Well, it can't be a God to have a child with a birth defect like this. So, boom, I'm going to turn it off. I'm just going to shut it out. Or another response is to turn it up. Is there some way that God can make this useful in my life and in the people around me?
Wow.
And that's a choice that we have. And neither choice is automatic, and people go different directions. But again, back to that cross image, the pattern we have is not a pain-free existence. It's redemptive pain, that God, nothing is wasted. God can take that stuff that's garbage that we don't want, that we want to get rid of, and somehow turn it into good.
So good. So good. Kind of keeping in line with this deconstruction idea, Philip, it seems like when you actually engage in reconstructing a true faith in the true living God, that it actually, instead of it becoming more concrete, he seems to be more mysterious. It's like the more that I grow in my walk with the Lord, I'm like, oh, there's more mystery to him than there is something that I can actually tangibly define in a lot of ways. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that as you were in that process of deconstructing and you were reconstructing, and if that's true for you, if you feel like that's a true thing, that God just, the mystery of God seems to become a little bit more enlarged in our life. How do we navigate that?
Hi, friend. One of the questions we get asked most frequently here at Nothing is Wasted is, how do I help my friend who has just experienced a trauma, tragedy, or major life transition? We know there are so many of you who listen to our podcast and who follow the work we do because you want to help those you love as they walk through a difficult season. We love the compassionate hearts of those within the Nothing is Wasted community and appreciate your desire to help bring healing and hope to the many and to the one, which is why I wanted to share with you a resource that we have called When Everything Changes, Navigating the Early Days of Loss, Trauma, and Tragedy. In this 4-session mini course, participants will hear from me, as well as Davey Blackburn, our founder, and also the podcast co-host, Aubrey Sampson. Aubrey is also the author of The Louder Song, a best-selling book on lament. I'll share with you practical ways to walk them through whatever valleys they found themselves in recently. We know our Pain to Purpose course is such a helpful and proven pathway for those who have had a little time to process their pain. But we wanted to also have something for those who are in the immediate aftermath of their lives changing forever. This is a great resource that you can purchase and share with your friend who has found themselves in a story very different from what they expected. In each session, they will get practical wisdom on what to expect in those early days, how to lament, and what support they need as they go through this marathon of healing. If you'd like to send this to a hurting friend, simply go to nothingiswasted.com/everythingchanges and select the course When Everything Changes gift option. We are so grateful for compassionate individuals like you who are willing to step into the pain of those they love and walk them through it. And we hope you'll find resources like this course and this podcast to be the tools you need to help those who are struggling when everything changes.
I can go back to things that I wrote 40 years ago and wince a little bit, saying I sounded so confident back then. And it's not that simple. It's not that clear. So what do you do about that? Well, in the church I grew up in, the response was, well, you got to agree to all of these. Here's the 43 essentials of faith that you have to sign on to. And, I'm not there. There is a lot that we don't know, that we can't pin down. And to me, it's kind of ungracious. John, describing Jesus, says that he came full of grace and truth. And the church works really hard on that truth. That's why there are 45,000 denominations in the world, because they each think they have the truth. And I just wish that people would spend more time competing to be grace-filled, grace dispensing, as much as they compete to be truth-filled, truth dispensing, both of which are important, but I think they've been kind of out of balance. And so to the person who is struggling there, I would say, just look at Jesus. Jesus was clear in his teaching, but most of the time he was going around helping people. He was actually at hands-on ministry, healing, casting out demons, and visiting the sinners, doing that kind of stuff. And if you have a spark of there's something Jesus like I want in my life, and yet you're kind of pinned down by some of the mystery questions that you can't solve. There are people who have wrestled with those mystery questions, and take your time. You can investigate them, but don't just sit in your room reading these books. Join one of these prison ministries, or start working for your local homeless shelter or those kind of things, where you're with people who have real problems, and we've got some basic, simple answers. And a lot of the problems in the world can be solved by people just showing kindness and love and grace. Wow. And that's what we're called to do. And the more you start acting instead of just thinking, then the more you're like Jesus. And I think that's true all over the world. And it's the story of how the faith spread all over the world by people who weren't just trying to make converts, but people who are trying to give God's grace and show what God is like. And then others were attracted to that. It's like the Roman Empire, persecuting Christians, and yet gradually Christians in a couple centuries just took over the Roman Empire. More than 50% of all the people became Christian. Why? Well, the historians tell you one big reason is because when the Romans would discard their babies, that was their form of birth control, just leave them out in the elements and some wild animal or weather will get them. The Christians would take them in and adopt them. This is good for church growth. and when the plague would hit a Roman town and the pagans would flee into the hills so they didn't get sick, the Christians would stay behind and nurse and feed not only their relatives, but their pagan neighbors' relatives. And after a while, people started saying, I like the way they live better than the way I live. I want what they've got, and that's how the gospel spreads. And so that's why that message of grace is so important, because not that many people that I've met in my life become Christians because they lose an argument. That's not why you get transformed. You get transformed when you have a need and somebody cares about that need, shows you love, and is with you at those crucial times. And that's why grace keeps flowing to the lowest part. Wow.
Well, one of the tributaries, I guess, of grace is forgiveness. I know forgiveness is something I've had to wrestle through quite a bit in my own journey. And but I also know that, someone such as yourself who's experienced church hurt, disappointment by people, woundings, abuse, those kinds of things, they're wrestling through for the concept of forgiveness too. I hesitate to open up this can of worms with only a few minutes left, but I'm just curious as to what forgiveness, how that's played into your own journey, and how that threads into this whole idea of grace, and as we are really learning to run toward Jesus rather than just running away from something.
You're absolutely right. And I told my story in great detail in a memoir called Where the Light Fell. And at the end of that book, I went back and I started what I called an amends tour. So I went back to people that had hurt me, and then also people I had hurt, especially in my writing, because I've been pretty open in my criticisms of the church, and I don't usually use the person's names, but they know who I'm writing about, and I know I've hurt them. So I went to a whole series of them, some pastors and others, and tried to make amends. And it really is like taking off chains. You got a burden, and it's no fun just to walk around with a chain around your neck, but you can take it off. And if you don't do that, the great line from Annie Lamott, who's this funny Christian woman, who says something about not forgiving is like eating rat poison and waiting for the other person to die.
Yeah.
You're the one who is being poisoned by unforgiveness.
Yeah.
Those chains that are around you, or that poison eating inside of you. And the only way to get it out is to break that chain somehow,
Wow.
to forgive. And it works both ways, for me to forgive and to be forgiven.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always happen, and sometimes it's only one way. And it's very controversial. I remember there was that mass killing in Charleston, the African American church, and the gentleman got up the very next day and said, "I forgive you." And some people were quite upset about that, saying he shouldn't be forgiven. He should be punished at the full extent of the law, which is also true.
Right.
But boy, look at what happened there with that strong statement of forgiveness compared to what happened with other places, Minneapolis and other places, where race riots broke out because of that harshness and that injustice.
Yeah.
The forgiveness is not fair.
Yeah.
It's unfair. By definition, it's unfair.
Right.
It's not karma, but it's an opportunity for grace.
Yeah, that's so good.
And some of the stories of forgiveness that I've known personally are the best examples of grace that I know.
So good. Well, I love that you're saying that, because I do think that there are a lot of people that express criticism. The situation you just alluded to, in Charleston, I remember feeling criticized as well, and being criticized for saying almost immediately, I've chosen to forgive my wife's killers. But I look at, stories like the martyrdom of Stephen, or Jesus even on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Even in the middle of the act. And the way, Philip, I've always just processed through that is that this is Stephen in this situation, Jesus saying, I trust God, the ultimate judge, to be the arbiter in this situation. I'm choosing not to hold on to this myself. I'm not going to take on the burden of being the arbiter in this situation, because he is a perfect judge. And I think that's a huge component of forgiveness, is to say, God, I trust you with this.
Yeah.
And I'm releasing that.
You're absolutely right. And you can see the Apostle Paul struggling with that, because, in the book of Romans, he describes all the ways he was mistreated over the years.
Yeah.
And then in Romans 12, he finally says, yes, but revenge is God's.
Yeah.
It's as if he's saying, I don't trust myself to be the arbiter of justice. I know what I'd like to do, but I don't think that's right. I trust God. It's not going to just disappear. There will be some sort of recompense. Yeah. But I'm not a good person to try to balance that out. I've got to trust God instead.
Yeah. Man. Oh, this has been such a wonderful conversation. My goodness. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. I want to make sure everybody goes and picks up a copy of the memoir that you just alluded to, and that we've been talking about a little bit, Where the Light Fell. You released it last year, as well as all of the other books that you've written over the years. We'll make sure we put it in the show notes here, and right underneath the YouTube, on this YouTube page right here, we'll put all of links to Philip Yancey's books. But man, thank you so much. This has just been incredible. Where can we stay up to date and follow what's going on in your life and other stuff that you're doing?
Well, I'm old fashioned, so I've got a website, just philipyancey.com. And then
you
I have
on TikTok yet, Philip? Are you on TikTok?
No dancing. I don't do Instagram. I don't do Twitter, X, whatever it's called. But I do Facebook, like people my age do. And then I do a monthly blog and various postings. So Facebook would be the same thing, Philip Yancey, my name. And then website would be philipyancey.com.
Oh, man. Well, thank you so much. This has been just such an honor to have you on the Nothing is Wasted podcast.
What you're doing is what you should be doing, and it's helping so many people, Davey. And it's a beautiful example of redeemed pain. I came up with this phrase that's almost like a mantra to me. Pain redeemed impresses me more than pain removed. And I really believe that. We want God to take away whatever that thing is. but God sometimes has a different plan of
Wow.
making good out of stuff that is not good. That is the story that we can offer the world, the watching world.
Wow. Wow. Pain redeemed impresses me more than pain removed. Wow. I'm going to hang on to that one.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome to it.
Thank you. Well, Aubrey, that was an incredible conversation.
I mean,
Of course.
that
Did
guy
not
lives up
disappoint.
to his reputation. Yeah, there's just the gravitas of someone who has stayed
man.
faithful and seen the ups and downs
Yes.
of the church, seen the ups and downs of just a life. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yet stay faithful to Jesus and seen God in all of that. It's beautiful. It's so inspiring. It's so faith building.
Yeah.
I love it. You kind of said this before, but I appreciate that he comes to these conversations with such thoughtfulness and depth. There's no sort of shallow
Nope.
pithiness
Nope.
at all
And that's
with
what-
Philip Yancey.
Every time that I do an interview, you do an interview, I know that's what you hope for as well, is that people are going to come and go, hey, let's not do canned answers here.
Yeah,
Let's not do
right.
the company line, so to speak. Let's
Right.
actually talk about
Yeah.
what we're really dealing with. And that's what I
Yeah.
value about not only what Philip Yancey did in this interview, but what he has continually invited us as believers to do in his
Wow.
writings. It's
Yeah,
like,
that's so true.
hey, listen, he even talked about, it was down in the basement that there were these actual, real, vulnerable conversations that were happening. There was more ministry taking place there
Then
than
there
up
was
in the sanctuary.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
I think that's so poignant. You're like, wow,
Mm-hmm.
that's where real transformation takes place, is when we have these kinds of vulnerable conversations
yeah.
and we're willing to talk about the yuck. And I just literally, right before we stepped into this, Aubrey, I was sharing something with Christy, just something that it was like a thing I'm not proud. I'm like, I'm wrestling with this kind of thing. You can call it idolatry, you can call it whatever you want. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily need to disclose what it was, but
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't like what I'm feeling, and it feels icky.
Yeah.
And she looked at me and she goes, "Thank you for sharing that with me. Like,
Oh.
thank you for sharing that ick and just gave me a big hug." And I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel like
she
my heart was
did.
completely transformed right there.
That's so beautiful.
But isn't that the point, right? Where
Yeah,
it's like,
it is.
this
It
is what
is.
Jesus invites us into, that it's his loving kindness that leads us to repentance. And I can bear some of the stuff of the ickiness of my heart and go, I don't like that I'm wrestling with this right now.
Yeah, but to have someone receive it well too, like
Yeah.
it's so transformational. And I think it also, well, we know this. I know, and you know, it gives the other person permission that too to be like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, me too. Here's my yucky stuff I'm dealing with.
Yeah.
Because if somebody has to go first, I think in the vulnerability, and then that gives
Right.
people permission. And ultimately, it's like, because we need Jesus. Like, none of us are perfect. None of
Right.
us are Jesus. And so it's nice to just be like, oh yeah, I'm not. So I'm struggling with this thing. And it's
Yep.
gross.
Guess what? I'm human.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and this is a safe space to talk
What a
about
good
my
wife you
humanity.
have. I love that she
No, I
just
have
said, thank you for
amazing-
sharing that with me.
I have an amazing wife.
Beautiful.
One of the things that Philip said in this conversation right at the very end that really struck me is he said, pain redeemed impresses me more than pain removed.
That was like mic drop fire. All of it.
I was like, wow, hold on. I wish we had had more time to unpack
Yeah,
that. I'm like, wait a minute, let's
totally.
unpack that a little bit.
Say more.
Because spoiler alert, Aubrey, you and I have a little bit of a conversation that the listeners are going to be able to be privy to soon, me and you, where we interview you on the podcast and kind of the
Yeah.
season that you're going through. But we talked
Yeah.
a little bit about that in that conversation, this idea of like, okay, it's really the evidence of true faith is when God doesn't show up the way you thought he was supposed to show up in your life,
Yes.
and you still remain faithful and trust him.
I am telling you, I like more and more and more, I am convinced that like that's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And we of course don't do that in our own strength, right? Like
course not.
it's God's faithfulness that sustains us
Right.
to stay faithful.
Right.
And yet, because the weird mystery of our faith and the paradox of it all is God does partner with us. And I
Yeah.
do believe we've got choice in the matter. And like
Yep.
when I am facing pain, heartache, grief, when my dreams aren't coming true, when God isn't showing up the way I want God to, will I stay put?
Yeah.
You know, or am I going to run to all the other things that I run to? And probably the reality is we're all going to wrestle somewhere in that tension.
Right.
And yet I think the people who can say, I am going to choose to be, my fidelity is to Jesus, no matter what my circumstances look like. I do think that there's blessing and there's joy and there's goodness on the other side of that.
So true.
Whether we see it on earth or not, I just know God has goodness for that faithful person.
That's so true. And yeah, and to the listener, or if you're watching this on YouTube, if you're going like, well, okay, I don't understand. So Aubrey just said that faith is given to me. I can't like white knuckle my way through this. It's given to me for me to be faithful. How does all that work? Truthfully, we don't understand how all that works. I mean, that's a mystery, because Scripture seems to indicate both, and that's what this whole partnership is. If you're like, okay, well, how do I stay faithful? How do I trust God still in this? Well, Scripture says things like, when you've done everything to stand is what it says, right?
Yep.
And that's Ephesians 6, right? And then there's other situations like what you just said, where this faith was given to us so that we can't boast.
Yeah.
Specifically, let's talk about the faith of salvation, but there's also bleeds into just faith to sustain, faith to there's so much just that God is moving us forward. And so we can't white knuckle our way through this. And yet at the same time, I think that there's this like indication from Scripture that we can almost block that faith from. There's some things that can squelch that or squeeze that out of our lives.
Yes.
By whether it is Jesus would acknowledge, like, even the people in his hometown, that he marveled at their lack of faith. Like, there's twice in Scripture it says Jesus marveled. One was at the faith of a Gentile, someone who was not Jewish, the centurion whose servant was sick.
Yeah.
He marveled at his faith. He's like, oh my gosh, I've not seen anybody who's had this kind of faith in all of Israel. Yeah. And then he marveled at Nazareth, the people of Nazareth, their lack of faith. And then it says, and I can't quite put my thumb on what this means, but it says he could not do miracles there.
That passage to me is so wild that he could, because of their lack of faith, because of their unwillingness to like see that Jesus was who Jesus said he was, he couldn't do. Yeah, it's interesting, certainly, to consider.
Right.
Does our faith? What role does our faith play in Jesus doing miracles, ministry happening, outbreak of miracles happening? I mean, it's interesting. It's a very interesting conversation. So obviously, what's clear is both extremes are not true, right? Right.
Both extremes that like, oh, we somehow manufacture all of this up and we can strong arm God's will by our faith. No,
not true.
The other side of the other ditch that we're going to be liable to fall in is believing that somehow it's only God and we have no partnership with him.
We're totally
in this,
passive
and we're just
or something. Yeah,
completely passive in this whole
robots
thing. Somehow it seems like God's going, hey, I need you to open your heart and your mind up to the idea that I am who I say that I am. I am faithful. And as you open that up, I'm going to impart in you more faith to believe and to be sustained.
I always think about the incarnation of Jesus, right? Fully God, fully man, fully God, fully without division, without separation, without change, without a problem. Right. Fully God, fully man. And there's something I think even in that as a model, the way God works with us, fully God, fully us. Like there's something about that that's part of what it means to walk in faith.
That's great, Aubrey. Right? I hadn't thought about that. Yes. It's not like a half-half.
Right.
It's like, and this is a pithy way to say it, right? But this is, when you say this when you preach, people, they love it. They're like,
it works.
Yeah, it works. It's like, when you respond and you put your natural, God will put his super over it and supernatural things happen, right? But it is
so good.
There's indication, right, where God says, okay, I want you to take a step into the Jordan River first.
Yes.
Then you're going to watch it part. So there's obedience
then you'll watch me move. Yep.
that precedes this, and that obedience demonstrates that I have faith that you're going to do what you say that you're going to do, that you are who you say you are. So I think we could spend hours talking about this, trying to break this down. Many people who are much smarter than us have for centuries debated over this. Maybe we should just ask Philip Yancey to come back.
Yeah,
on.
let's have Philip Yancey come back.
Can you
That
unpack that a little bit more for us?
We need more. That was such a great conversation. Pain
Oh,
redeemed
my
impresses me more than pain removed. Hey, Davey, we got a few things we want to tell our people about. One, I want to remind you, listeners, that if you want to find out more about getting started, getting involved in the ministry of Nothing is Wasted, we have more than the podcast. Like, the podcast is one of our entry points, but we've got coaching, we've got content, we've got all kinds of things for you. We'd love to invite you to something called 5 Steps to Taking Back Your Story. It's a Zoom call with Davey. It's free. It's live. Go to nothingiswasted.com/start here to find out more about that. We also want to thank Sleeping at Last for providing all of the music for the Nothing is Wasted podcast. We want to invite you to be sure to like and follow us at Nothing is Wasted Ministries. Rate the podcast on Apple Podcasts to help others find these inspiring stories as they walk through their own valleys. Quick book release info, Davey. You want to share anything?
Yeah, just go to nothingiswastedbook.com and you can find all the information on book release, pre-orders, joining the launch team, book launch event that we're doing here in Indianapolis. We would love for you to come out. Make it a weekend.
Exciting.
Just come on out and hang out with us live. We'll have all the information about that right there at nothingiswastedbook.com and more information to be revealed as we get that information. So be sure to go to nothingiswastedbook.com. Next week, we have a great conversation with Raleigh Sadler. And so I want to make sure that I point your attention to that. Come back and join us next time, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on a podcast platform of your choice. Make sure you tune into this. Get that little update we were talking about. You're going to get that little update every Thursday. This thing's going to release. But Raleigh Sadler, listen to this little clip from our conversation with Raleigh.
I would have never pictured myself starting an organization like Let My People Go, where we're empowering the local church to fight human trafficking, this global injustice, by loving those most vulnerable, by finding the people that a trafficker would target in the first place and saying, what if we got to them first? What if we cared for them first? What if we were able to meet their need, not only spiritual, because, we're in a great place for that. We have the setup to meet spiritual needs. But what if we could meet physical, emotional, and psychological needs? What if we could partner with collaborative agencies in the community and be part of this person's healing journey? What if I could see this person as an invitation from God for relationship rather than an imposition? And so that had to happen in my life first. And then that came out through me into Let My People Go. Because really, that when I started Let My People Go, I was like, something's been changing in me. How can I translate that to as many churches as possible? And I think that's what happens. I think God changes us first before we change the world around us.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.